To our amazing viewers at Cheating Tales Lab, welcome and thank you. Your presence makes these stories worth sharing. We'd love to hear, which part of the world are you joining us from? Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Foundations Built on Blood. Vincent Morrison stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a conquered territory. At 42, he commanded an empire built from concrete, steel, and ruthless ambition. Morrison Construction had risen from a single bulldozer and a $20,000 loan to a multi-million-dollar operation that reshaped skylines across 3 states. But Vince hadn't built his empire with handshakes and smiles. He'd built it with calculated brutality that left competitors buried under lawsuits, workers too terrified to unionize, and city officials who owed him favors they could never repay. The scars on his knuckles told the story of his early days, when collecting debts meant more than phone calls and lawyers. At 19, fresh out of a group home that had hardened him like tempered steel, Vince had learned that mercy was a luxury he couldn't afford. When Tony Marcelli had tried to muscle in on his first construction site, Vince hadn't called the police. He'd waited in Tony's garage with a crowbar and left him with a limp that served as a permanent reminder. Word spread quickly. Vincent Morrison wasn't someone you crossed. His marriage to Diana Ashworth 15 years ago had been as calculated as every other decision in his life. She was the daughter of a prominent lawyer, beautiful enough to grace magazine covers, and connected to old money that opened doors his blue-collar background couldn't. Diana had been dazzled by his intensity, his hunger for success, and the way he took what he wanted without apology. She'd thought she was marrying a diamond in the rough. What she'd actually married was a weapon disguised as a man. Their son Blake, now 14, had inherited Vince's sharp intellect but Diana's gentler nature, a combination that both pleased and worried his father. Vince loved his boy fiercely, but love in the Morrison household came with expectations. Blake would inherit the empire, but only if he proved worthy of the Morrison name. The intercom buzzed, pulling Vince from his thoughts. "Mr. Morrison, your 3 p.m. is here," his secretary announced. "Send him in." The door opened to admit Carlos Reeves, his site foreman and the closest thing Vince had to a friend. Carlos had been with him for 12 years, ever since Vince had pulled him out of a bar fight and offered him a job. Unlike the yes-men who populated his boardroom, Carlos wasn't afraid to speak his mind. "We got a problem with the Riverside project," Carlos said without preamble, settling into the leather chair across from Vince's desk. City inspectors been sniffing around, asking questions about the foundation specs. Vince's jaw tightened. "Henderson? Yeah. Same prick who tried to shake us down last year." Inspector William Henderson had been a thorn in Vince's side for 3 years, ever since Vince had refused to inflate a contract to line Henderson's pockets. The man had been looking for any excuse to shut down Morrison construction projects, and Vince had been equally determined not to give him one. "What's he claiming?" "Says the concrete doesn't meet city standards. Wants to bring in an independent engineer." Vince leaned back in his chair, his mind already working through possibilities. Henderson was fishing, but that didn't make him less dangerous. A delayed project meant cost overruns, penalty clauses, and damaged reputation. But more than that, it meant someone was challenging Vincent Morrison's authority, and that was something he'd never tolerated. "Get me everything on Henderson," Vince said quietly. "Bank records, phone logs, where he eats lunch, who he sleeps with. Everything." Carlos nodded. He'd seen this look before. "How deep you want to go?" "As deep as it takes." After Carlos left, Vince stood again at his window, watching the sun cast long shadows across the city. Tomorrow was his and Diana's 15th wedding anniversary, and they had dinner reservations at La Bernardine, the same restaurant where he'd proposed. Diana had been excited about it for weeks, buying a new dress, getting her hair done. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine the evening. Candlelight, wine, his beautiful wife smiling across the table like she used to when they were young. The fantasy dissolved as his phone buzzed with a text from Blake. "Basketball practice canceled. Home early." Vince smiled slightly. Maybe he'd surprise Diana by coming home early himself. They could have some family time before tomorrow's celebration. He gathered his briefcase and headed for the elevator, unaware that his decision to leave early would shatter the carefully constructed world he'd spent 2 decades building. The drive to his Westchester estate took 40 minutes through increasingly upscale neighborhoods. The Morrison house sat on 5 acres of manicured grounds, a Georgian colonial that proclaimed success without vulgarity. Diana had insisted on the location, close enough to the city for business, far enough out for privacy and prestige. As Vince pulled into the circular driveway, he noticed Troy Kellerman's black BMW parked near the side entrance. Troy was Diana's old friend from college, a smooth-talking real estate broker who'd been coming around more frequently lately. Diana claimed he was helping her find properties for her charity work, but something about the man's too-perfect smile and wandering eyes had always irritated Vince. He entered through the front door, calling out, "Diana? I'm home early." No response. The house felt unusually quiet, with intention he couldn't identify. He set his briefcase down and walked toward the kitchen, then stopped as he heard voices from the direction of the pool house. "Can't keep doing this, Troy. Vince isn't stupid." Diana's voice, low and urgent. Vince moved silently toward the French doors leading to the pool area, his business instincts suddenly screaming warnings. "He suspects nothing," came Troy's reply. "The man's too busy crushing his enemies to notice what's happening in his own home. You don't know him like I do. When Vincent Morrison decides someone's betrayed him, then we make sure he never finds out." Vince's hand tightened on the door handle as he processed what he was hearing. The conversation continued, but the words blurred together as a cold rage settled over him like a familiar coat. 15 years of marriage. 15 years of building something together, of trust, of shared dreams for their son's future. He thought of the anniversary dinner tomorrow, of Diana's excited preparations, of the diamond necklace he'd bought her, a surprise that now felt like a monument to his own blindness. Moving with the silence that had served him well in darker days, Vince retreated to his study and poured 3 fingers of bourbon. He sat in his leather chair, the same chair where he'd planned the destruction of competitors and the acquisition of rivals, and began to think. By the time Diana appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later, smiling and asking about his early arrival, Vince had already decided that forgiveness wasn't an option. There would be no confrontation, no shouting match, no divorce lawyers dividing assets. Diana and Troy had made their choice, and now Vincent Morrison would make his. "Just wanted to surprise my beautiful wife," he said, kissing her cheek and tasting the lie on her lips. "Tomorrow's our big day, after all." Diana's smile never wavered, but Vince caught the flicker of guilt in her eyes, a tell he filed away for future use. As she chattered about the anniversary dinner and showed him her new dress, Vince nodded and smiled and began to plan their destruction with the same methodical precision he'd once used to build his empire. Some men forgave. Some men forgot. Vincent Morrison did neither. Chapter 2. The Hunter's Patience. The next morning brought unseasonably warm October weather, and Diana Morrison moved through her routine with the practiced elegance of a woman who'd spent 15 years playing the perfect corporate wife. She'd risen early to prepare Vince's breakfast, steel-cut oats with berries, black coffee, and the financial section of 3 newspapers arranged just as he liked them. It was a ritual that had remained unchanged since their 2nd year of marriage, one of many small performances that maintained the illusion of domestic harmony. Vince watched her from behind his newspaper, cataloging details he'd never noticed before. The way she avoided his eyes when she refilled his coffee, the slight tremor in her hands when she laughed at his casual observations about their anniversary dinner, the fact that she'd showered before he woke up, something she hadn't done in years. "Troy called," she mentioned as she cleared his plate. "He wanted to know if we'd reconsidered his suggestion about the Hamptons property." "What Hamptons property?" Vince asked mildly, though his fingers tightened on the newspaper. "The one I mentioned last week. For the charity auction. He thinks we could get it donated if we approached the right people." Vince had no memory of this conversation, which meant it had never happened. Diana was establishing an alibi, a reason for Troy's continued presence in their lives. The realization that his wife was not only cheating but actively planning to continue filled him with a cold satisfaction. Calculated betrayal was easier to punish than passion. "I trust your judgment," he said. "You've always been good at reading people." The irony wasn't lost on either of them, though only Vince appreciated it. At Morrison Construction, Vince found Carlos waiting with a thick manila folder. "Henderson's file," Carlos said, dropping it on the desk. "Guy's cleaner than a baptized baby, at least on paper." Vince flipped through bank statements, credit reports, and surveillance photos. Henderson lived modestly on his inspector's salary, attended church regularly, and had been married to the same woman for 23 years. But Vince had learned long ago that everyone had pressure points. You just had to know where to look. "What about family?" Vince asked. "Daughter's a junior at Northwestern. Pre-med. Wife works part-time at a dental office. College is expensive. Yeah, and Henderson's been taking out loans. Kid's smart, but smart don't pay tuition." Vince smiled. There it was. Henderson couldn't be bought, but he could be motivated. A man who played by the rules because he believed the system would reward virtue. Exactly the type Vince had built his career destroying. "I want to meet with Dr. Patricia Reeves," Vince said. Carlos looked confused. "My sister? The one at Northwestern's admissions office." "The very one. Set it up for tomorrow." As Carlos left, Vince's phone buzzed with a text from Diana. "Can't wait for tonight. Love you." 3 heart emojis followed the message. Vince wondered if she'd sent similar texts to Troy, or if emotional manipulation was reserved exclusively for her husband. Either way, the performance was almost insulting in its transparency. Vince spent the afternoon in meetings, but his mind was elsewhere, constructing and discarding plans. Diana and Troy thought they were being clever, conducting their affair under his nose while maintaining the pretense of friendship and business. They'd underestimated him, assuming that his focus on business made him blind to personal betrayals. It was a mistake that would cost them everything. At 5:30, Vince dismissed his secretary and locked his office door. From his private safe, he retrieved a cell phone that existed only for situations requiring absolute discretion. The number he dialed connected him to a voicemail system with no identifying message. "This is VM," he said after the beep. "I need a comprehensive package on Troy Kellerman, real estate broker in Westchester County. Everything: financial, personal, professional, recreational. Timeline is flexible, but thoroughness is essential. Usual compensation." The phone went back in the safe. By tomorrow evening, Vince would know Troy Kellerman better than the man knew himself. Knowledge was the foundation of all effective revenge, and Vincent Morrison had never built anything on a weak foundation. At home, Diana was putting the finishing touches on her appearance for their anniversary dinner. The black dress was new, as were the shoes and jewelry. She looked stunning, and Vince told her so, meaning every word. Whatever else she was, Diana remained the most beautiful woman he'd ever known. That beauty had been the hook that caught him 15 years ago, and tonight it would be the stage for her final performance as his wife. "You look handsome," she said, adjusting his tie with the familiarity of long marriage. "I'm glad we're doing this. Sometimes I feel like we're just ships passing in the night." "Tonight's about us," Vince replied, taking her hand. "Just you and me." La Bernardine was exactly as he remembered. Intimate lighting, impeccable service, and the subtle hum of conversation from New York's elite. Their table overlooked the harbor, where yachts bobbed like expensive toys in the evening light. Vince had proposed at this very table, young and hungry and certain that Diana Ashworth was the perfect partner for the empire he intended to build. Now, watching her smile and laugh and play the role of devoted wife, he marveled at how completely he'd misread her character. Or perhaps she'd simply changed, grown bored with the security he provided and hungry for the excitement that came with risk and deception. "Do you remember our first date?" Diana asked over the appetizer course. "You wore a red dress. We went to that little Italian place in Soho. And you told me you were going to be rich someday. I told you I was going to own half of Manhattan." "Close enough." She raised her wine glass. "To dreams that come true." They clinked glasses, and Vince saw his reflection in the crystal. A successful man toasting his wife on their anniversary, surrounded by luxury and accomplishment. To any observer, they were the picture of marital success. "I have something for you," Vince said, producing the jewelry box he'd carried in his jacket pocket. Diana's eyes widened as she opened it to reveal a diamond necklace worth more than most people's cars. "Vincent, it's beautiful. You didn't have to. I wanted to." He stood and moved behind her chair to fasten the necklace, his hands gentle on her neck. 15 years deserves something special. She turned to kiss him, and for a moment, Vince almost believed they could return to what they'd once been. Almost. But the memory of yesterday's overheard conversation burned away any lingering sentiment. The evening continued with all the proper rituals: fine wine, excellent food, reminiscences about their early years together. Diana was the perfect companion, attentive and charming and apparently devoted. She was also, Vince realized, a far better actress than he'd given her credit for. As they prepared to leave, Diana excused herself to the ladies' room. Vince watched her go, then checked his phone to find a message from his investigator. Package ready. Will deliver tomorrow a.m. When Diana returned, she was glowing with wine and apparent happiness. This was perfect, she said, linking her arm through his. Thank you for tonight. Thank you for 15 wonderful years, Vince replied. The drive home was quiet, both of them seemingly content in the afterglow of a perfect evening. Diana dozed against his shoulder while Vince drove through the darkened suburbs, past houses where other couples were living their own lies and truths. At home, Diana headed upstairs while Vince checked his home office. A single message waited on his secure phone. Henderson's daughter been placed on academic probation. One more strike and she's out. Vince smiled as he deleted the message. Henderson's leverage was dissolving, and tomorrow would bring Troy Kellerman's secrets. The pieces were falling into place with the same inevitable precision that had characterized every major construction project he'd ever managed. Upstairs, Diana was already in bed, the diamond necklace glittering on the nightstand. She smiled sleepily as he joined her. I love you, Vincent. I love you too, he replied, and meant it. Love and hate, he'd learned, weren't opposites. They were different facets of the same overwhelming emotion. He loved Diana Morrison, the woman who'd shared his dreams and borne his son. He hated Diana, the adulteress, the liar, the woman who'd betrayed everything they'd built together. Tomorrow would begin the process of separating one from the other. As Diana's breathing deepened into sleep, Vince stared at the ceiling and planned. Some men would have confronted their cheating wives immediately, demanding explanations and apologies. Others would have hired lawyers and fought over assets. Vincent Morrison was going to do something far more permanent. Diana and Troy had chosen their path. Now Vince would show them where it led. Chapter 3, The Son's Warning. Blake Morrison had inherited his father's instinct for reading people and his mother's sensitivity to emotional undercurrents, a combination that made him preternaturally aware of the tension crackling through his house like an electrical storm. At 14, he was old enough to understand that his parents' marriage had been deteriorating for months, but young enough to hope that whatever was wrong could still be fixed. That hope died on Tuesday afternoon when he came home early from basketball practice. Coach Martinez had canceled practice due to a family emergency, and Blake had decided to surprise his parents by getting home before dinner. He'd been looking forward to telling his father about his acceptance into the advanced mathematics program, news that he knew would make Vince proud. The house was quiet when he entered through the kitchen, his sneakers silent on the marble floor. His parents' voices drifted from the direction of his father's study, low and intense. Blake paused, something in their tone triggering the same instinct that had kept him alive during the 3 years he'd spent navigating the social minefield of prep school politics. Can't do this anymore, Diana. His father's voice was colder than Blake had ever heard it. I know about Troy. The silence that followed was deafening. Blake pressed himself against the kitchen wall, his heart hammering as he processed what he'd just heard. Troy Kellerman, his mother's friend who'd been coming around more and more lately. The hushed phone calls. The way his mother's mood had been swinging between guilty anxiety and giddy excitement. Vincent, please, let me explain. Explain? The single word carried enough venom to kill. Explain how you've been fucking my son's godfather for the past 6 months? Blake's world tilted sideways. Troy Kellerman was his godfather, chosen by his parents when Blake was baptized 14 years ago. The man had been at every birthday party, every Christmas morning, every important moment of Blake's life. And he was sleeping with his mother. It's not what you think, Diana said, her voice breaking. It just happened. We never meant. Shut up. The words were spoken quietly, but they carried the weight of absolute authority. Don't insult my intelligence with explanations. I heard you yesterday, in the pool house. Blake closed his eyes, fighting nausea. Yesterday afternoon, when his father had come home early and seemed so happy at dinner. He'd been pretending, playing a role while his world collapsed around him. What do you want? Diana whispered. I want you to understand something, Vince said. I built this family the same way I built my business, with absolute loyalty and zero tolerance for betrayal. You violated the only rule that mattered. And Blake is my son. He'll always be my son. But you, the pause stretched like a blade being drawn across skin. You're already dead to me. Blake heard footsteps and frantically looked for an escape route. The pantry door was closest, and he slipped inside just as his father emerged from the study. Through the crack in the door, Blake watched Vince walk to the kitchen island, pour himself a glass of water, and stand there for a long moment with his back to the pantry. When his father finally moved toward the stairs, Blake remained hidden, trying to process what he'd witnessed. His father wasn't planning to forgive or forget. He was planning something else entirely. And Blake knew enough about Vincent Morrison's reputation to understand that whatever was coming would be permanent. Diana appeared in the kitchen 10 minutes later, her face streaked with tears. She moved like a sleepwalker, opening and closing cabinets without purpose. When she finally noticed Blake emerging from the pantry, she froze. "Blake, I didn't know you were home." "Mom." He studied her face, seeing her as if for the first time. "Are you okay?" "Of course, sweetheart. Just tired." She attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How was practice?" "Canceled." Blake watched her carefully. "Mom, is something wrong?" "You and Dad seem." "Everything's fine," she said quickly. "Your father's just stressed about work. You know how he gets." Blake nodded, playing along. But he'd seen his father under work stress before, and this was something else entirely. This was Vincent Morrison in predator mode, the same coldly focused intensity that had built an empire and destroyed anyone who stood in his way. That evening, dinner was a masterpiece of performance art. Vince was charming and attentive, asking about Blake's day and discussing weekend plans with apparent enthusiasm. Diana played her part perfectly, the devoted wife and mother who just happened to be betraying everything she claimed to hold dear. Blake contributed to the conversation while studying both parents with new eyes. His father's warmth felt calculated, a mask worn for his benefit. His mother's cheerfulness had a manic edge that suggested she was barely holding herself together. After dinner, Blake retreated to his room and tried to focus on homework, but his mind kept returning to his father's words. "You're already dead to me." Vincent Morrison didn't make threats, he made promises. And Blake had never known his father to break a promise, good or bad. The next day at school, Blake moved through his classes in a daze. His best friend Connor noticed his distraction during lunch. "You look like someone died," Connor observed, stealing a French fry from Blake's untouched tray. "Maybe someone did," Blake muttered. "What's that supposed to mean?" Blake looked at Connor, 14 years old, worried about algebra tests and asking girls to the fall dance. Normal teenage problems that seemed impossibly distant now. "Nothing. Family stuff." "Your parents fighting again?" "Again." The word suggested that Blake's attempts to hide his family's deteriorating situation hadn't been as successful as he'd hoped. Connor had been his friend since elementary school, and Blake realized he'd been unconsciously sharing more than he'd intended. Something like that. Connor was about to respond when Blake's phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Coming to pick you up early. Doctor's appointment." Blake frowned. He didn't have any scheduled appointments, and his mother never picked him up from school. She was supposed to be at her book club until 4 o'clock. 20 minutes later, Blake found himself in the passenger seat of his mother's Mercedes, driving through neighborhoods he didn't recognize. Diana's hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and she kept checking the rearview mirror as if she expected to be followed. "Mom, where are we going?" "We need to talk," she said. "Somewhere private." She pulled into a parking lot beside a small lake surrounded by walking trails. It was the kind of place where joggers and dog walkers came to exercise, anonymous and unremarkable. Diana chose a bench near the water's edge, far from any other people. "Blake, I need you to listen to me very carefully," she began. "Your father, he's not the man I thought I married." Blake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October breeze. "What do you mean?" "He's dangerous. More dangerous than you know." Diana's voice was barely above a whisper. "He's done things. Terrible things. To people who crossed him." "Mom, you're scaring me." "Good. You should be scared." She turned to face him fully. "Last night, he threatened me. Not with lawyers or divorce courts. He threatened to." She stopped, seemingly unable to finish the sentence. "To what?" "To make me disappear." Blake's blood turned to ice. He thought of his father's reputation in the construction industry, the whispered stories about competitors who'd crossed Vincent Morrison and lived to regret it. Or in some cases, hadn't lived at all. "We need to go to the police," Blake said. Diana laughed bitterly. The police? Half the cops in this county owe your father favors. The other half are afraid of him. She gripped Blake's hands. We have to leave. Tonight. I have money hidden away, enough to get us started somewhere else. What about Dad? Your father will survive. He always does. Diana's eyes were bright with unshed tears. But I won't. Not if we stay. Blake stared across the lake, his mind racing. Everything his mother was saying aligned with what he'd overheard the night before. His father had crossed a line from cold anger into something much darker. But running away felt like abandoning everything he'd ever known. Where would we go? I have a cousin in Oregon. She's agreed to help us. Diana pulled out a burner phone Blake had never seen before. I've been planning this for weeks. Ever since I realized what your father was capable of. The pieces clicked together in Blake's mind. His mother's affair wasn't just about Troy Kellerman. It was an escape route. She'd been planning to leave all along, and the affair had simply provided the final motivation. What about school? My friends. We'll figure it out. The important thing is staying alive. Blake looked at his mother, really looked at her. The fear in her eyes was genuine, but so was something else. Relief. She wanted to run not just from his father's threats, but from the life she'd built. The affair, the lies, the growing tension, it had all been leading to this moment. I need time to think, Blake said. We don't have time. Diana's grip tightened on his hands. Your father's planning something. I can see it in his eyes. The same look he had before the Martindale incident. Blake had heard whispers about the Martindale incident, a competing contractor who'd tried to undercut Morrison Construction on a major project. Daniel Martindale had ended up in the hospital with a shattered kneecap and a clear understanding that Vincent Morrison was not to be crossed. Tonight, Diana continued. After your father goes to sleep, we pack light and we leave. Blake nodded slowly, but his mind was already working through possibilities his mother couldn't see. Diana Morrison was planning to run from her problems. Blake Morrison was Vincent Morrison's son, and Vincent Morrison had taught him that running solved nothing. On the drive home, Blake made his decision. He would warn his father, not to save his mother from the consequences of her betrayal, but to save his father from doing something that would destroy their family completely. That evening, as his parents continued their performance of domestic normalcy, Blake waited for his opportunity. It came when Diana excused herself to run errands. Errands that Blake now understood were final preparations for their escape. He found his father in the study, reviewing construction blueprints with the focused intensity that had built an empire. Dad, we need to talk. Vince looked up, and Blake saw something flicker in his father's eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Or pride. What's on your mind, son? Blake took a deep breath and chose his words carefully. Mom's planning to leave tonight. She wants me to go with her. Vince set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. And what did you tell her? I told her I needed time to think. But you've already decided. Yes. Blake met his father's gaze steadily. I'm not going. For the first time in days, Vince smiled. A real smile, not the calculated mask he'd been wearing. I'm proud of you, Blake. Your mother made her choice. You've made yours. Dad, what are you planning to do? Vince studied his son for a long moment. What do you think I should do? It was a test, Blake realized. His father was asking him to choose not just sides, but principles. Vincent Morrison's principles, which included loyalty, consequences, and the understanding that some betrayals could never be forgiven. I think, Blake said carefully, that people should face the consequences of their choices. Vince nodded slowly. Then you understand. Blake did understand. His mother had chosen Troy Kellerman over her family. She'd chosen deception over honesty, selfishness over loyalty. And Vincent Morrison had never allowed anyone to escape the consequences of betraying him. What do you need me to do? Blake asked. His father's smile widened. Nothing. Just be my son. As if summoned by their conversation, Diana's voice called from the front hall. I'm home. She appeared in the study doorway moments later, her cheeks flushed from the cold and her eyes bright with nervous energy. What are you two plotting in here? Just father-son bonding, Vince said easily. Blake was telling me about his day. Diana's gaze moved between them, and Blake saw the moment she realized something had changed. Her son was no longer the boy she could manipulate into running away with her. He was Vincent Morrison's heir, and he'd chosen his side. Blake, honey, I need to talk to you upstairs, she said. Actually, Blake replied. I was just heading to Connor's house to study. His mom's driving me. It was a lie, but Diana couldn't challenge it without revealing her own plans. She watched helplessly as Blake kissed her cheek and headed for the door, leaving her alone with the husband she'd betrayed and the future she could no longer escape. As Blake walked to Connor's house, he would actually go there, making his alibi real. He felt something settle inside him. The choice had been made. His mother had chosen her path, and now she would walk it to whatever end his father deemed appropriate. Blake Morrison was his father's son, and Vincent Morrison had taught him well. Loyalty was everything, and betrayal was unforgivable. Chapter 4. The Architect's Blueprint. Vincent Morrison sat in his study long after Blake left for Connor's house, watching Diana pace the living room through the doorway like a caged animal sensing the approach of the hunter. She'd made 3 phone calls in the past hour, all brief, all whispered, all confirming what he already knew. Tonight would be her last night as Mrs. Vincent Morrison, though not in the way she was planning. The investigative file on Troy Kellerman lay open on his desk, a comprehensive dissection of a man who'd proven to be exactly what Vince had expected: weak, entitled, and tragically overconfident. Troy's real estate business was failing, propped up by increasingly desperate gambles and loans from people who collected debts with interest that compounded in blood. His affair with Diana wasn't passion, it was opportunism, an attempt to secure his financial future through the Morrison fortune. But the most interesting detail in the file was Troy's weekend hobby: recreational flying. He'd been piloting small aircraft for 15 years, on a Cessna 172 that he kept at a private airfield in Connecticut. According to the investigators' notes, Troy had been teaching Diana to fly, supposedly as a surprise for Vince's birthday next month. Vince smiled as the pieces of his plan crystallized. Some men destroyed their enemies with bullets or blades. Vincent Morrison preferred irony. His secure phone buzzed with a text: package delivered to secondary location. Awaiting instructions. Diana appeared in the study doorway, her face a mask of forced calm. I'm going to bed early. I have an early morning appointment. Sleep well? Vince replied without looking up from his papers. Sweet dreams. The casual cruelty in his tone made her flinch. She lingered in the doorway as if she wanted to say something, then turned and headed upstairs. Vince waited until he heard their bedroom door close before making his next call. Carlos, it's Vince. I need the crew at the Riverside site tomorrow morning. Full hazmat protocol. Boss, we're not scheduled to start demo until next week. Change of plans. And Carlos, make sure the men understand that this is a private matter. No paperwork, no official records. Understood. Vince's next call was to Dr. Patricia Reeves at Northwestern University. Carlos's sister was an assistant dean in the admissions office, a woman who'd been quietly grateful for the Morrison Foundation scholarship that had funded her own daughter's education. Dr. Reeves? This is Vincent Morrison. I need a favor. 20 minutes later, Inspector Henderson's leverage had evaporated. His daughter would receive a full scholarship to Northwestern's medical school, conditional on maintaining her current GPA and her father's immediate cooperation with all Morrison construction projects. Henderson would learn about his daughter's good fortune first thing in the morning, along with the understanding that academic scholarships could be revoked as easily as they were granted. By midnight, Diana was asleep, or pretending to be. Vince slipped out of bed and dressed in dark clothing, moving with the silence that had served him well in his younger days when problems were solved with direct action rather than lawyers and leverage. The drive to Troy Kellerman's house took 30 minutes through empty suburban streets. Troy lived in a modern colonial that was impressive from the outside but mortgaged beyond its value. Another detail from the investigative file that would prove useful. Vince parked 3 blocks away and approached through the wooded lot behind Troy's property. The security system was basic, designed to stop opportunistic burglars rather than determined professionals. Vince disabled it with tools he hadn't used in years but hadn't forgotten how to employ. Troy was in his home office, apparently too anxious to sleep. He was hunched over his computer, frantically typing what appeared to be emails to potential clients. The desperation was visible in his posture, the slumped shoulders of a man watching his world collapse in real time. Working late, Vince asked from the doorway. Troy spun around, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and terror in rapid succession. Vincent, what are you? How did you get in? Vince stepped into the office and closed the door behind him. We need to talk. Troy's eyes darted toward the phone on his desk. Vince shook his head slowly. That would be a mistake. Listen, Vincent, whatever you think you know. I know you've been fucking my wife for 6 months. I know you're broke. I know you've been planning to run away with Diana and my son tonight. Vince moved to the window and closed the blinds with deliberate precision. I also know that you're not nearly as smart as you think you are. Troy's face had gone pale. It's not what you think. Really? Then enlighten me. Diana came to me. She was unhappy, said you were becoming dangerous. She needed someone to talk to. So you talked her right into bed. It just happened. Troy's voice cracked. We never meant for it to go this far. Vince studied the man who'd been his son's godfather, searching for any trace of remorse or dignity. He found neither. Where were you planning to go? Vince asked conversationally. What? Tonight. When you and Diana ran away. Where was the destination? Troy's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Finally, he whispered, I don't know what you're talking about. Vince sighed and pulled out his phone. A few taps brought up a recording application and several audio files. We can't keep doing this, Troy. Vince isn't stupid, came Diana's voice from the phone's speaker. Then we make sure he never finds out, was your reply. Should I play the rest? Troy collapsed into his desk chair as if his strings had been cut. What do you want? I want you to understand something, Vince said, echoing the words he'd spoken to Diana 2 days earlier. For 20 years, I've built my reputation on a simple principle. Cross Vincent Morrison, and there are consequences. Not legal consequences. Not financial consequences. Permanent consequences. You can't just. Can't what? Kill you. Vince laughed softly. Troy, I've been killing people since I was 19 years old. The difference is that I've gotten smarter about it. These days, I prefer to let people destroy themselves. He pulled a thick manila envelope from his jacket and tossed it onto Troy's desk. Your financial records. Bank statements, loan documents, payment histories. Very interesting reading. Troy's hands shook as he opened the envelope. How did you? The Kozlov brothers are looking for you. Did you really think borrowing $200,000 from Russian loan sharks was a sustainable business strategy? The blood drained from Troy's face. They said I had 6 months. That was 4 months ago. Your payment's overdue. I can get the money. The Harrison deal is about to close. The Harrison deal fell through yesterday. Your client decided to go with Morrison Properties instead. Vince smiled. Coincidentally, I happen to know the seller. We go way back. Troy stared at the documents, his financial death sentence laid out in black and white. What do you want? He whispered. I want you to keep your date with my wife tonight. What? Diana's planning to meet you at the airfield at 2 a.m. Your plane, your flight plan to Oregon. Romantic, really. Vince checked his watch. You have 90 minutes to get there. I'm not flying anywhere with Diana. Yes, you are. Because if you don't, I'm going to call the Kozlov brothers and tell them exactly where to find you. I'm also going to call the IRS and provide them with detailed records of your unreported income. And then I'm going to call your ex-wife's lawyer and inform them about the assets you've been hiding from the divorce settlement. Each threat landed like a physical blow. Troy had built his life on a foundation of lies and shortcuts, and Vincent Morrison had just handed him a sledgehammer aimed at the supporting pillars. You want me to fly Diana to Oregon? I want you to take off with Diana at 2 a.m., following the flight plan you filed yesterday. What happens after that is entirely up to you. Vince pulled out a second envelope, this one containing cash. $25,000. Enough to disappear properly, if you're smart enough to abandon the plane somewhere remote and travel the rest of the way by car. Troy's eyes widened as he processed the implications. You're paying me to kidnap your wife. I'm paying you to give Diana exactly what she wants. A new life far away from Vincent Morrison. Vince's smile turned predatory. Of course, if anything were to happen to that plane during the flight. Well, small aircraft accidents are tragically common. Mechanical failures, weather issues, pilot error. The FAA investigates thoroughly, but sometimes there just aren't any survivors to explain what went wrong. The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Troy understood now. He wasn't being offered a choice between escape and punishment. He was being offered a choice between probable death and certain death. The money's yours either way, Vince continued. But if you decide to be creative about the flight plan, there's another $25,000 waiting for you in a Swiss account. All you need is the routing number, which I'll provide once Diana's travel plans are finalized. Troy's hands trembled as he reached for the cash. You're asking me to kill her. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm simply pointing out that Diana Morrison is worth $2 million in life insurance, and that airplane accidents are notoriously difficult to investigate when the wreckage ends up in the Atlantic Ocean. Vince stood and moved toward the door. 2 a.m., Troy. Don't disappoint me. What about Blake? Blake made his choice. He chose family loyalty over maternal manipulation. Vince paused at the doorway. He'll mourn his mother's tragic death, but he'll understand that some losses are necessary for the greater good. As Vince left Troy's house, he felt the same cold satisfaction that had sustained him through 20 years of business warfare. Diana had chosen betrayal over loyalty. Troy had chosen greed over honor. Now they would face the consequences of those choices together, 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. Some men forgave their enemies. Some men forgot past wrongs. Vincent Morrison eliminated future problems. Chapter 5. The Evening Before Forever. Diana Morrison stood before her bedroom mirror at 1:15 a.m., staring at a reflection she barely recognized. Gone was the polished corporate wife who'd graced charity galas and business dinners for 15 years. In her place stood a woman preparing to abandon everything she'd ever known for an uncertain future with a man she wasn't even sure she loved. The overnight bag at her feet contained the essentials of her escape: clothes for a week, important documents, the $20,000 in cash she'd been accumulating for months, and the burner phone that had become her lifeline to Troy. Everything else, the designer wardrobe, the jewelry, the carefully curated life of luxury, would remain behind like artifacts from an abandoned civilization. She'd written Blake a letter, though she doubted he would ever read it. Her son had chosen his father's side with a finality that still took her breath away. 14 years old, and already he possessed Vincent's cold calculation, his ability to cut emotional ties when loyalty was questioned. In trying to save Blake from his father's influence, Diana realized she'd lost him completely. The house was silent around her, but she could feel Vincent's presence like a weight in the air. He was awake, she was certain of it, probably sitting in his study, planning her destruction with the same methodical precision he'd once used to court her. Diana had seen that look before, directed at business rivals and municipal officials who'd made the mistake of crossing Vincent Morrison. She'd never imagined becoming its target. Her phone buzzed with a text from Troy. Plane ready. See you soon. Everything will be okay. Diana wanted to believe that. Troy had been her anchor these past months, the only person who understood the suffocating weight of being Vincent Morrison's wife. But even as she prepared to run away with him, doubts gnawed at her consciousness. Troy was charming and attentive, but was he strong enough to protect her from Vincent's inevitable pursuit? And if not, what would happen to both of them when her husband's patience finally ran out? She moved silently through the house, avoiding the stairs that creaked and the floorboards that groaned. Vincent had taught her the layout during their first year of marriage, pointing out which routes allowed for silent movement, knowledge he'd gained during his own days of settling disputes with direct action rather than lawyers. The garage was dark and cold, her Mercedes waiting like a faithful servant. Diana had chosen it over Vincent's tracking-equipped vehicles because she'd paid for it with her own inheritance, making it harder for him to trace. Every detail of her escape had been planned with paranoid precision, the kind of forward thinking that came from living with a man who'd built his empire on strategic patience and overwhelming force. The drive to the airfield took 25 minutes through empty Connecticut countryside. Diana kept checking her mirrors, expecting to see headlights following her, but the roads remained deserted. Maybe Vincent was letting her go. Maybe his pride wouldn't allow him to chase a wife who'd rejected him so completely. The hope lasted until she reached the airfield and saw Troy's Cessna illuminated by runway lights. Something was wrong. She could sense it in the way Troy moved around the aircraft, checking instruments with mechanical precision rather than his usual casual confidence. When he looked up at her approach, his face was pale in the harsh lighting. "You're late," he said, his voice strained. "I had to be careful." Diana studied his expression, recognizing fear when she saw it. "Troy, what's wrong?" "Nothing. Just nervous. Big step, you know." But Diana knew Troy well enough to recognize his tells. The way he avoided her eyes, the slight tremor in his hands, the sweat on his forehead despite the cool October air. These were signs of more than pre-flight anxiety. "Has Vincent contacted you?" Troy's head snapped up. Why would you ask that? Because you look like someone who's seen a ghost. I'm fine. Let's just get going. Troy gestured toward the plane. Weather's supposed to turn bad in a few hours. Diana remained where she was. Troy, if Vincent threatened you. He didn't threaten me. The response came too quickly, too emphatically. Diana, please. We need to leave now. Against her better judgment, Diana allowed Troy to help her into the passenger seat. The Cessna's interior was cramped but comfortable, equipped with the modern avionics that Troy was so proud of. Under normal circumstances, she would have been excited about her first real flight. Tonight, the plane felt like a coffin with wings. Troy completed his pre-flight checklist with uncharacteristic haste, his movements sharp and urgent. When he started the engine, the propeller's roar seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet night. Diana fastened her seatbelt and tried to shake the feeling that she was making a terrible mistake. Troy. She placed her hand on his arm as he prepared to taxi. Tell me the truth. Did Vincent find out about tonight? Troy's laugh was hollow. Vincent Morrison finds out about everything, Diana. The question is what he chooses to do with the information. What's that supposed to mean? Instead of answering, Troy pulled out an envelope and handed it to her. Diana's blood turned to ice as she recognized Vincent's precise handwriting on the outside. For Diana, with love. Inside was a single sheet of expensive stationery, the same stationery Vincent used for business correspondence that required his personal touch. Diana, by the time you read this, you'll have made your final choice. I want you to know that I understand. Marriage to Vincent Morrison was never going to be easy, and I recognize that I became someone you could no longer love. I also want you to know that I remember the woman I fell in love with 15 years ago. Beautiful, intelligent, passionate, and hopelessly naive about the kind of man you were marrying. That woman deserved better than the life I gave her. Unfortunately, the woman you became, the one who chose deception over honesty, adultery over loyalty, deserves exactly what she's about to receive. Troy will explain the details of your journey. I trust you'll find the accommodations appropriate to your circumstances. Give my regards to the Atlantic Ocean. Vincent. P.S. Blake sends his love. He's proud to be his father's son. Diana's hands shook as she processed the letter's implications. Troy, what does this mean? Troy was already taxiing toward the runway, his face set in grim determination. It means your husband is a more creative bastard than either of us imagined. Troy, stop the plane. I can't. What do you mean you can't? Troy's voice was barely audible over the engine noise. He knows about the Kozlov brothers. He knows about the hidden accounts. He knows everything, Diana. If I don't follow his instructions exactly, I'm a dead man. What instructions? Instead of answering, Troy pulled out a second envelope and tossed it in her lap. This one contained photographs, surveillance shots of Troy meeting with dangerous-looking men, bank records showing his crushing debts, and a detailed breakdown of his financial crimes. Vincent made me an offer, Troy said as they reached the runway. $50,000 to give you exactly what you wanted, escape from your marriage. Diana's stomach dropped. You're taking me to Oregon. No. Troy's voice was dead. I'm taking you over the Atlantic Ocean. About 50 miles offshore, this plane is going to experience a catastrophic mechanical failure. The runway lights stretched ahead of them like a path to hell. Diana grabbed Troy's arm desperately. You can't do this. You love me. I thought I did. But your husband made me realize something. I love being alive more. Troy pushed the throttle forward, and the Cessna began its takeoff roll. Diana watched the trees flash past the windows, knowing she had perhaps minutes before they reached the point of no return. The $50,000 isn't enough, she said quickly. I have access to accounts Vincent doesn't know about. Offshore money. Millions. Troy glanced at her, hope flickering in his eyes. How much? 3 million. Swiss accounts my father set up before he died. It was a lie, but desperation made her convincing. Kill me, and you get 50,000. Keep me alive, and we split 3 million. The plane lifted off the runway, climbing into the dark sky. For a moment, Diana thought she'd bought herself more time. Then Troy reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device she didn't recognize. Your husband thought you might try something like this, he said. He gave me a recording device, programmed to transmit everything we say directly to his phone. Diana's blood turned to ice as she realized Vincent had been listening to every word of their conversation. Somewhere in their house, Her husband was hearing her final desperate lies, probably smiling at her pathetic attempts to save herself. So you see, Troy continued, even if you really had $3 million, Vincent would know about it in real time. And his instructions were very specific. Any deviation from the flight plan, and the Kozlov brothers get my home address. The Cessna climbed steadily into the night sky, carrying Diana toward an appointment with the Atlantic Ocean that her husband had arranged with characteristic precision. She thought of Blake, asleep in his bed, already practicing the grief he would display when news of the tragic accident reached him. She thought of Vincent, probably pouring himself a bourbon and reviewing the insurance paperwork. Most of all, she thought of the moment 15 years ago when she'd said yes to Vincent Morrison's proposal, seduced by his intensity and blinded by his success. She'd married a man who built empires and destroyed enemies, never imagining that one day she would become both. How long? She asked quietly. Troy checked his instruments. 20 minutes to the coordinates your husband specified. Diana closed her eyes and tried to pray, but found she'd forgotten how. Vincent Morrison had been right about one thing. She'd become someone unrecognizable, a woman who chose selfishness over loyalty and paid for that choice with her life. The only question now was whether Troy would have the courage to survive what came next. Chapter 6. The Performance of Grief. Blake Morrison sat at his kitchen table at 6:47 a.m., mechanically eating cereal while his father read the morning news on his tablet. To any observer, they appeared to be a normal family starting another normal day. The only thing missing was Diana, who was supposedly sleeping late after her early morning jog. Blake had been awake since 3 a.m., listening for sounds that never came. His mother's return, his father's departure. Anything to indicate that the terrible machinery of the previous night had somehow been averted. Instead, he'd heard only silence, the kind of absolute quiet that spoke louder than screams. Your mother left early for her charity meeting, Vincent said without looking up from his tablet. She'll probably be gone most of the day. Blake nodded, playing his part in the performance. What about you? Normal day at the office. You. School. Basketball practice after. Good. Vincent's voice carried the same paternal warmth it always had, as if nothing fundamental had shifted in their world. I'll pick you up after practice. Maybe we'll grab dinner somewhere nice. The casual normalcy of the conversation was more chilling than any dramatic confrontation could have been. Blake understood now why his father was so successful in business. Vincent Morrison could lie with his entire being while looking you directly in the eyes. Blake's phone buzzed with a text from Connor. You okay? You seemed weird yesterday. He typed back. Fine. See you at school. But Blake was far from fine. He was an accomplice now, bound to his father by shared knowledge and mutual silence. Part of him wanted to believe that Diana had simply been scared away, that Vincent's threats had been enough to make her abandon her plans without any actual violence. But Blake knew his father too well to cling to such comfortable delusions. At school, Blake moved through his classes like an actor hitting his marks, responding to teachers' questions and laughing at friends' jokes while his mind remained fixed on the terrible certainty of what his father had done. When his phone rang during lunch period, he nearly jumped out of his skin. Blake Morrison? The voice was official, authoritative. Yes. This is Captain Walsh with the Connecticut State Police. I need to speak with your father immediately. There's been an accident. Blake's heart hammered as he processed the words. The performance was beginning. What kind of accident? A plane crash. I can't discuss details over the phone, but it involves your mother. Is your father available? He's at work. I can give you his number. After providing his father's contact information, Blake sat in the cafeteria bathroom and tried to process what he'd just heard. Plane crash. The perfect cover for murder, designed to look like the kind of tragic accident that befell small aircraft every year. His father hadn't just killed Diana. He'd orchestrated her death with the same attention to detail he brought to major construction projects. Blake's phone rang again. This time it was Vincent. Blake, I need you to come home immediately. There's been an emergency. I know. The police called me first. A pause. What did they tell you? That mom was in a plane crash. I'm sending Carlos to pick you up. Don't talk to anyone else until I get there. The line went dead. Blake gathered his things and headed for the main office, his movements mechanical. He was Vincent Morrison's son, and Vincent Morrison's son would know how to react to devastating news. Carlos was waiting in the school parking lot, his expression grim but not surprised. They drove in silence through suburban streets that looked exactly the same as they had that morning, though Blake felt as if he were viewing them through glass. Present, but separate from the normal world where mothers didn't disappear in planned airplane accidents. At home, Blake found his father in the study, speaking quietly with two men in suits who radiated the kind of professional sympathy that came with years of delivering bad news. Vincent's face was a masterpiece of controlled anguish, the successful businessman struggling to process an incomprehensible tragedy. "Blake," Vincent said, rising to embrace his son. "Thank God you're here." Blake allowed himself to be held, feeling his father's steady heartbeat against his chest. Even in this moment, Vincent's pulse was calm and controlled. "These are Detectives Morrison and Park from the State Police," Vincent continued. "They're investigating your mother's accident." Detective Morrison, no relation, despite the shared name, was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to dealing with grieving families. "Blake, I'm very sorry for your loss. I know this is difficult, but we need to ask you some questions about your mother's activities yesterday." Blake sat in the chair his father indicated, his mind racing through the script he needed to follow. "Of course. When did you last see your mother?" "At dinner. Around 7 o'clock. How did she seem?" Blake glanced at his father, who nodded encouragingly. "Normal. Maybe a little excited about something, but she didn't say what." "Did she mention any plans to go flying?" "No. I didn't even know she knew how to fly a plane." Detective Park, a younger man with sharp eyes, made notes on a tablet. "According to the flight plan, she was traveling with Troy Kellerman." "Did you know Mr. Kellerman?" "He's my godfather," Blake said, the words tasting like ashes. "He's been friends with my parents for years." "Any idea why they might have been flying to Oregon together?" Blake looked genuinely confused, the easiest emotion to fake when you were 15 and your world had just imploded. "Oregon? No, that doesn't make sense." Vincent placed a protective hand on Blake's shoulder. "Officers, my son's been through enough shock for one day. If you have more questions." "Of course," Detective Morrison said. "Blake, you've been very helpful. We may need to speak with you again as the investigation progresses." After the detectives left, Blake and Vincent sat in the study without speaking. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, highlighting dust motes that danced in the air like tiny ghosts. "Are you okay?" Vincent asked finally. Blake considered the question seriously. Was he okay with his mother's death? With his father's actions? With his own complicity in the cover-up? "She made her choice," Blake said. Vincent's smile was proud and cold. "Yes, she did. What happens now?" "Now we grieve appropriately. We cooperate with the investigation. We rebuild our lives." Vincent's voice carried the certainty of a man who'd planned for every contingency. "The investigators will find evidence of mechanical failure, a fuel line that deteriorated due to poor maintenance. Troy was always careless about proper inspections." Blake understood. His father had sabotaged the plane, ensuring that the crash would appear accidental to even the most thorough investigation. Diana and Troy had died believing they were escaping, never realizing they were flying in a machine designed to become their tomb. Will they find the bodies? Probably not. The Atlantic is very deep where they went down. That evening, Blake and Vincent went through the motions of a normal dinner, though neither had much appetite. Vincent fielded calls from friends and business associates who'd heard the news, accepting condolences with appropriate gravity, while Blake listened to his father play the role of devastated widower. Mrs. Kellerman called, Vincent mentioned as they cleared the dishes. "Troy's ex-wife. She wants to know about funeral arrangements." "What did you tell her?" "That we'd hold a memorial service once the investigation is complete. Probably next week." A memorial service for a woman who died according to a script written by her husband. Blake wondered if Vincent would cry at the funeral, if he'd deliver a eulogy praising Diana's memory while knowing exactly how she'd spent her final moments. "Dad," Blake said as they finished cleaning up, "do you ever regret anything?" Vincent considered the question seriously. "I regret that your mother chose to betray us rather than work through our problems. I regret that she involved Troy, destroying his life along with her own. I regret that you had to learn such hard lessons about loyalty at such a young age. But you don't regret killing her." "I didn't kill her, Blake. She killed herself the moment she chose another man over her family." Vincent's voice was matter of fact, devoid of guilt or uncertainty. I simply facilitated the consequences of that choice. Blake nodded, understanding something fundamental about his father and, by extension, about himself. Vincent Morrison didn't see himself as a murderer. He saw himself as an agent of cosmic justice, ensuring that people received exactly what their actions deserved. "I'm proud of you," Vincent continued. "Yesterday, you chose loyalty over sentiment. That's not an easy choice for a 14-year-old to make. It didn't feel like a choice. The best decisions rarely do. When you know who you are and what you stand for, the right path becomes obvious." That night, Blake lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of a house that no longer contained his mother. Tomorrow, he would return to school and accept sympathy from teachers and friends who believed his mother had died in a tragic accident. He would attend her memorial service and watch his father deliver a eulogy. He would grow up in a house where Diana Morrison had simply disappeared. Blake Morrison was his father's son, heir to an empire built on loyalty, ruthlessness, and the understanding that some betrayals could only be answered with death. The boy who'd wanted to save his family was gone, replaced by someone harder and colder, someone worthy of the Morrison name. In the master bedroom down the hall, Vincent Morrison slept peacefully for the first time in months, secure in the knowledge that justice had been served and order restored. Diana had made her choice, Troy had paid his debts, and Blake had proven himself worthy of inheriting everything his father had built. The Morrison Empire would continue, stronger and more ruthless than ever. Some men forgave their enemies. Some men forgot past wrongs. Vincent Morrison eliminated future problems and taught his son to do the same. Chapter 7. Ghosts and Revelations. 3 weeks after Diana Morrison's funeral, Blake found himself standing in his mother's walk-in closet, staring at clothes that would never be worn again. The memorial service had been a masterpiece of orchestrated grief, Vincent delivering a eulogy that brought tears to every eye in the church, Blake playing the devastated son with an authenticity that surprised even himself. The community had rallied around them, offering casseroles and condolences and promises that time would heal their wounds. But time, Blake was learning, didn't heal anything. It simply taught you to carry your secrets more efficiently. "Blake," Vincent's voice drifted up from downstairs. "We have visitors." Blake descended to find Detective Morrison and Detective Park standing in the foyer, their expressions more serious than during their previous visits. Vincent stood beside them wearing his public face, the successful businessman still reeling from an incomprehensible tragedy. "What can we do for you, officers?" Vincent asked. "We've completed our preliminary investigation into the crash," Detective Morrison said. "There are some details we'd like to discuss." They settled in the living room, Blake and Vincent on the sofa while the detectives took the opposing chairs. The afternoon light streaming through the windows felt accusatory, as if the sun itself were conducting an interrogation. "The good news is that we've recovered some wreckage," Detective Park began. "The bad news is what we found in that wreckage." Blake felt his father's stillness beside him, the kind of absolute control that had characterized every crisis in Vincent Morrison's life. "What do you mean?" Vincent asked. Detective Morrison opened a folder and withdrew several photographs. The plane's fuel system had been tampered with. Someone deliberately weakened a fuel line, causing it to fail during flight. Blake's heart hammered, but Vincent's expression remained perfectly neutral. "Tampered with? You mean sabotaged?" "That's exactly what we mean. This wasn't an accident, Mr. Morrison. Someone wanted that plane to crash." The silence that followed was deafening. Blake stared at the photographs, seeing twisted metal and burn patterns that had once been Troy Kellerman's pride and joy. Somewhere in that wreckage were the remains of his mother and her lover, victims of Vincent Morrison's surgical precision. "I don't understand," Vincent said slowly. "Who would want to hurt Diana?" "That's what we're trying to figure out. Mr. Morrison, we need to ask some difficult questions about your marriage." Blake watched his father transform into the grieving widower seeking justice for his murdered wife. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. Of course, anything to help find who did this. "Were you and Diana having marital problems?" Vincent's pause was perfectly timed, long enough to suggest reluctance, short enough to avoid suspicion. "Every marriage has its challenges. We've been going through a rough patch, but nothing that couldn't be worked out." "What kind of rough patch?" Diana had been distant lately, preoccupied. "I thought it was stress from her charity work, but now." Vincent's voice trailed off suggestively. Detective Park leaned forward. Now you think what? I hate to say this, but I'm wondering if Diana was involved with someone. Someone who might have wanted to eliminate me from the picture permanently. Blake marveled at his father's audacity. Vincent was deflecting suspicion by painting himself as the intended victim, suggesting that Diana's affair had somehow led to the sabotage of the plane they'd both died in. Do you have any evidence of an affair? Detective Morrison asked. Vincent hesitated again, the reluctant husband forced to expose his wife's infidelity. I found some things. Text messages, credit card receipts for restaurants I'd never been to. I was planning to confront her about it after our anniversary. The detectives exchanged glances. Blake could see them reassessing their assumptions, considering the possibility that Diana Morrison had been the perpetrator rather than the victim. Mr. Morrison, Detective Park said carefully, is it possible that Diana and Mr. Kellerman were planning to leave you? That someone else discovered their plans and decided to stop them permanently? Vincent's voice broke convincingly. I can't believe Diana would abandon Blake. Whatever problems we had, she loved our son. Blake felt a stab of genuine pain at his father's words. Diana had been planning to take him with her, to tear him away from everything he'd ever known. The fact that Vincent was now using that planned kidnapping to deflect suspicion was almost beautiful in its cruel efficiency. Blake, Detective Morrison turned to him with gentle eyes. Did you notice anything unusual about your mother's behavior in the weeks before her death? Blake looked at his father, who nodded encouragingly. She seemed excited about something. Nervous, but excited. And she was on her phone a lot more than usual. Did you ever see her with Mr. Kellerman? Sometimes. He'd come over for dinner or business meetings. He was my godfather. Blake's voice cracked on the last word, a genuine emotion that enhanced his credibility. The detectives spent another hour asking questions, most of which Vincent deflected with masterful performances of grief and confusion. By the time they left, Blake could see that their focus had shifted from Vincent as a potential suspect to Diana as a possible victim of her own romantic entanglements. Brilliant, Blake said after the detective's car disappeared down the driveway. Necessary, Vincent corrected. The truth is often less important than perception. Those detectives want to solve a case, and I've given them a solution that makes sense within their worldview. You think they'll buy it? They already have. A cheating wife, her lover, and a mysterious third party who wanted them dead. It's exactly the kind of love triangle murder that gets featured on crime shows. Vincent poured himself a bourbon from the bar cart. Within a month, they'll be looking for Diana's other lover, the jealous man who couldn't bear to see her run away with Troy. Blake absorbed this lesson in misdirection. His father hadn't just planned Diana's murder. He'd constructed an entire alternative narrative that would keep investigators chasing shadows while the real perpetrator grieved publicly and rebuilt his life. What if they find evidence that leads back to you? They won't. The sabotage was carried out by professionals who don't exist on any official records. The flight plan was filed by Troy using his own credentials. The fuel line failure will appear to be the work of someone with mechanical knowledge, but no connection to Morrison Construction. Vincent's smile was cold and satisfied. I've been planning this for 3 weeks, Blake. Every contingency has been considered. That evening, Blake found himself in his mother's study, the one room in the house that Vincent hadn't touched since her death. Diana's books still lined the shelves. Her reading glasses still lay on the desk beside a half-finished novel she would never complete. It was like stepping into a shrine to a woman who'd never existed, the loving wife and devoted mother that Diana had pretended to be. Blake opened the desk drawers systematically, not looking for anything specific, but unable to resist the urge to search for clues about the woman his mother had really been. Most of what he found was mundane: charity correspondence, social calendars, shopping lists. But in the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a stack of old magazines, Blake discovered something that made his blood run cold. A journal, Diana's handwriting, chronicling the last 6 months of her life in intimate detail. March 15th. Vincent came home early today and found me crying. I told him it was about the charity auction, but the truth is I can't stop thinking about Troy. What we did last week was wrong, but it felt more right than anything I've experienced in years. March 22nd. Troy says Vincent suspects something. Maybe we should stop seeing each other, but I can't. He makes me feel alive again, reminds me of who I used to be before I became Mrs. Vincent Morrison. April 3rd, Vincent's been watching me. I catch him studying my face when he thinks I'm not looking, and there's something in his eyes that terrifies me. I know what he's capable of when people cross him. Blake turned pages with trembling fingers, reading his mother's descent into adultery and paranoia. Diana had known she was playing with fire, but she'd been unable to stop herself. The entries became increasingly desperate as the weeks passed. May 10th, Troy thinks we should run away together. He has a plane, knows how to disappear. Part of me wants to say yes, but what about Blake? How can I abandon my son? May 18th, saw Vincent talking to Carlos about something that made them both laugh. Cold laughter, the kind that means someone's about to get hurt. I'm starting to think Troy might be right about leaving. June 2nd, Blake knows something's wrong. My beautiful boy is too smart for his own good, just like his father. If we run, I'll have to take him with me. Vincent would never forgive me, but staying might get us all killed. The final entry was dated the day before Diana's death. June 15th, Troy filed a flight plan to Oregon. My cousin Sarah has agreed to help us start over. I'm terrified, but staying here isn't an option anymore. Vincent knows about us. I can see it in his eyes. Tomorrow night, Blake and I leave everything behind. I just pray my son will forgive me someday. Blake closed the journal and sat in the darkening study, processing what he'd just read. His mother hadn't been planning to abandon him. She'd been trying to save him from becoming what he was already becoming. Diana Morrison had looked at her 14-year-old son and seen Vincent's ruthlessness taking root, threatening to consume whatever gentleness remained in Blake's character. She'd been right, of course. Blake Morrison was becoming his father's son in every way that mattered. The boy who'd once cried over injured animals was gone, replaced by someone who could watch his mother's murder being planned and choose his father's side without hesitation. Blake. Vincent's voice came from the doorway. What are you doing in here? Blake turned, the journal heavy in his hands. For a moment, he considered showing it to his father, confessing what he'd discovered. Then he looked into Vincent's eyes and saw the same cold calculation that had orchestrated Diana's death. Just missing Mom, Blake said, slipping the journal into his jacket. Vincent's expression softened with what might have been genuine sympathy. It gets easier. The pain fades, but the lessons remain. What lessons? That loyalty is everything. That family is sacred. That anyone who threatens what we've built together will face the consequences. Vincent moved to Diana's bookshelf and selected a volume of poetry she'd loved. Your mother forgot those lessons. She chose passion over duty, excitement over security. In the end, it cost her everything. Blake nodded, understanding that his father was delivering more than just commentary on Diana's fate. He was issuing a warning about the future. Vincent Morrison would accept no more betrayals from his family. The next person to threaten the Morrison empire might not get the mercy of a quick death in an airplane accident. I won't forget, Blake said. I know you won't. You're my son. As Vincent left the study, Blake remained behind with his mother's journal burning a hole in his jacket. He could destroy it, eliminating the last evidence of Diana Morrison's true feelings about her family. Or he could keep it, a reminder of the choice he'd made and the path he'd chosen. Blake Morrison tucked the journal deeper into his jacket and turned off the study lights. Diana's secrets would remain hidden, just like everything else in the Morrison family. Some truths were too dangerous to survive, and Blake was learning to be very selective about which truths he chose to preserve. Tomorrow, the investigation would continue. Detectives would chase shadows while the real killer grieved publicly and planned his next move. And Blake Morrison would continue becoming the heir his father needed, loyal, ruthless, and completely committed to the family business. The boy who might have mourned his mother's murder was gone. In his place stood Vincent Morrison's true son, someone who understood that power required sacrifice, and that some sacrifices were easier than others. Diana Morrison was dead. Her secrets were buried with her, and the Morrison empire would continue forever. Chapter 8. The Price of Knowledge. 2 months after Diana Morrison's funeral, Blake discovered that secrets had a way of multiplying like cancer cells, each revelation spawning new questions that threatened the carefully constructed narrative his father had built around his mother's death. It started with a phone call that came while Vincent was in the city, dealing with a labor dispute that required his personal attention. Blake was alone in the house, working on calculus homework, when the landline rang with an unfamiliar number. Morrison residence, Blake answered. Blake? Thank God. The voice was female, middle-aged, and thick with barely controlled panic. "This is Sarah Chun, your mother's cousin from Oregon. I've been trying to reach Diana for weeks." Blake's blood turned to ice. Sarah Chun, the cousin Diana had mentioned in her journal, the woman who was supposed to help them start their new life. "Mrs. Chun," Blake said carefully, "I'm sorry, but my mother, she died in a plane crash 2 months ago." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Blake wondered if the connection had been lost. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was hollow with shock. "Died? But she was supposed to." The words cut off abruptly. "Supposed to what?" Another pause. "Blake, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Was your mother planning to visit me?" Blake's mind raced through possible responses. Sarah Chun represented a loose in that Vincent might not have anticipated, someone who knew about Diana's escape plans and might ask uncomfortable questions. "I don't think so," Blake lied. "She never mentioned any trips to Oregon." "That's impossible. Diana called me 3 weeks before she died. She said she was bringing you to stay with me for a while, that it wasn't safe for either of you at home anymore." Sarah's voice grew more urgent. "Blake, she was terrified of your father. She said he'd found out about some kind of affair and was planning to hurt her." Blake felt the walls of his carefully constructed world beginning to crack. Sarah Chun wasn't just a distant relative. She was a witness to Diana's final weeks, someone who could testify that Diana Morrison had been fleeing for her life rather than running away for romance. "Mrs. Chun, I think there's been some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding. Your mother was scared, Blake. Really scared. She said Vincent Morrison had done terrible things to people who crossed him, and she was afraid she and Troy were next." The mention of Troy's name confirmed Blake's worst fears. Sarah Chun knew about the affair, the escape plans, even the specific people involved. If she decided to contact the police with her information, the entire narrative Vincent had constructed would collapse like a house built on sand. "I need to think about this," Blake said. "Blake, listen to me. If your mother was right about your father, then you might be in danger too. Do you have somewhere safe you can go?" "I'm fine, Mrs. Chun. My father loves me." "Your mother thought he loved her too, right up until she realized he was planning to kill her." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Sarah Chun wasn't just suspicious, she was certain. Diana had shared her fears with someone who was now in a position to expose everything. "I have to go," Blake said. "Blake, wait." He hung up and immediately dialed his father's cell phone. "Blake? What's wrong? We have a problem." Blake explained the conversation with Sarah Chun while Vincent listened in the kind of absolute silence that preceded violent action. When Blake finished, the silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. "Where are you now?" Vincent asked finally. "At home." "Stay there. Don't answer the phone. Don't answer the door. Don't talk to anyone." "I'm coming home." The line went dead. Blake sat in the kitchen, staring at the phone and trying to process the implications of what had just happened. Diana's cousin wasn't just a loose end. She was a witness who could destroy everything Vincent had built. And Blake had just delivered that information to a man who'd already proven his willingness to eliminate threats to his family. Vincent arrived home in 45 minutes, moving with the controlled urgency that characterized his approach to crisis management. He found Blake in the study, sitting in the same chair where they'd planned Diana's destruction months earlier. "Tell me exactly what she said," Vincent commanded. Blake repeated the conversation word for word, watching his father's expression grow more dangerous with each detail. When he finished, Vincent walked to the window and stood with his back to his son, staring out at the estate he'd built through violence and intimidation. "How much does she know?" Blake asked. "Everything." Diana was always too trusting for her own good. Vincent turned from the window, his face a mask of cold calculation. "Sarah Chun knows about the affair, the escape plans, and Diana's fears about my reaction. If she contacts the police, she'll destroy the narrative you created. Worse, she'll provide them with a motive and timeline that points directly at me." Vincent moved to his desk and pulled out a secure phone Blake had never seen before. "This is what's going to happen. Mrs. Chun is going to have an accident. Something believable. A home invasion, maybe, or a car accident. Tragic, but not suspicious." Blake felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You're going to kill her too. I'm going to protect this family. Sarah Chun represents an existential threat to everything we've built. She can't be reasoned with, bought off, or scared away. The only solution is permanent." Blake watched his father dial a number he clearly knew by heart. This wasn't the first time Vincent Morrison had ordered someone's death from the comfort of his home office. "It's Vincent," he said when the call connected. "I have a priority situation in Oregon. Sarah Chun, Portland area. Make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Yes, within the week. Usual compensation." Vincent hung up and looked at his son with the same expression he'd worn when explaining the facts of life years earlier. "This is what power really means, Blake. Not just the ability to build something great, but the willingness to do whatever's necessary to protect it. How many people have you killed? Directly? 3, not counting your mother and Troy. Indirectly?" Vincent shrugged. "I stopped counting after 20. The casual admission hit Blake like a physical blow. His father wasn't just a successful businessman who occasionally resorted to violence. He was a serial killer who'd built his empire on a foundation of corpses. "The first was when I was 19, Vincent continued, settling into his desk chair. "A gang member who tried to shake down one of my early job sites. I beat him to death with a piece of rebar and dumped his body in the foundation of a building that's still standing today." Blake stared at his father, seeing him clearly for the first time. Vincent Morrison wasn't a loving parent who'd been driven to extremes by his wife's betrayal. He was a predator who'd been killing people since before Blake was born. The second was a city inspector who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Car accident, very convincing. The third was a union organizer who was getting too close to some of my early business practices. Another accident. Vincent's smile was cold and proud. "I learned early that dead problems stay solved. And Mom, your mother was number 24. Or 25, if we count Troy separately." Vincent's voice carried no more emotion than if he were discussing quarterly earnings. "She made her choice, Blake. Just like Sarah Chun is making hers." Blake felt the last of his innocence die in that moment. His father wasn't a man who'd been driven to murder by extraordinary circumstances. He was a killer who'd found a way to profit from his pathology. Diana Morrison hadn't died because she'd betrayed her husband. She died because she'd threatened the business interests of a man who'd been murdering people for over 20 years. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're old enough to understand the truth. And because you're going to inherit all of this someday." Vincent gestured around the study, but Blake understood he meant more than just the house. The Morrison empire isn't built on construction contracts and real estate deals. It's built on fear, respect, and the absolute certainty that crossing us has permanent consequences. Blake's phone buzzed with a text message. "Unknown number. Blake, this is Sarah Chun. I'm flying to Connecticut tomorrow. We need to talk face-to-face about your mother. Don't tell your father." Blake showed the message to Vincent, who read it with the expression of a chess master watching his opponent make a predictable mistake. "Perfect," Vincent said. "She's coming to us." "What do you mean?" "Change of plans. Sarah Chun doesn't die in Oregon. She dies here. Quietly, cleanly, and in a way that eliminates any evidence she might have brought with her." Vincent's smile was predatory. "Your mother's cousin is going to have a tragic accident right here in Connecticut. Very sad, very final." Blake understood that he was witnessing the birth of another carefully constructed murder, planned with the same methodical precision his father brought to every business deal. Sarah Chun was flying into a trap that would close around her the moment she stepped off the plane. "What do you need me to do?" Vincent's smile widened with paternal pride. "What I've always needed you to do, son. Be a Morrison." Blake nodded, accepting his role in the murder of a woman who'd tried to help his mother escape. Sarah Chun would die because she knew too much, just as Diana had died for the same reason. And Blake Morrison would help his father cover it up, just as he'd helped cover up everything else. Some families pass down businesses. Some pass down traditions. The Morrison family passed down a legacy of violence that grew stronger with each generation. Chapter 9. The Final Performance. Sarah Chun arrived at Bradley International Airport on a gray Thursday morning, carrying nothing but a small overnight bag and 15 years of guilt about not staying closer to her cousin Diana. Blake watched her emerge from the terminal through the telephoto lens of a camera his father had given him, studying the face of the woman who would be dead before sunset. Sarah was younger than Blake had expected, maybe early 40s, with Diana's delicate bone structure and the same expressive eyes that had once made his mother so beautiful. She moved with nervous energy, constantly checking her phone and scanning the crowd as if she expected to be followed. She had no idea that she already was. She looks like Mom, Blake observed, lowering the camera. Genetics, Vincent replied from the driver's seat of their nondescript rental car. Diana always said the Chin family had good bones. Pity they didn't come with good judgment. They followed Sarah's taxi at a discreet distance, Vincent driving with the casual competence of someone who'd conducted surveillance operations before. Blake found himself studying his father's profile, trying to reconcile the man who'd taught him to ride a bicycle with the killer who was planning to murder an innocent woman for the crime of asking inconvenient questions. "Where's she staying?" Blake asked. "The Marriott downtown. I made sure she got a room on the 20th floor with a nice view of the city." Vincent's smile was cold, high enough to ensure the fall will be fatal. Blake's stomach clenched. "You're going to make it look like suicide?" Distraught woman, overwhelmed by grief over her cousin's death, takes her own life in a hotel room. Very tragic, very believable. Vincent pulled into a parking garage 3 blocks from the hotel. The beauty of suicide is that it explains away all the inconvenient questions. Why was Sarah Chun in Connecticut? To mourn her cousin. Why did she jump? Grief-induced depression. Case closed. They waited in the parking garage for 2 hours, giving Sarah time to check in and settle into her room. Vincent used the time to review photographs and floor plans his people had provided, studying the hotel's layout with the thoroughness of a general planning a siege. "Room 2012, Vincent said, checking his watch. "She should be getting my call right about now." Blake's phone buzzed with a text. "Blake, your father wants to meet me at the hotel bar at 3 p.m. Should I trust him?" Blake showed the message to Vincent, who nodded approvingly. "Perfect." She's scared but curious. The combination will get her exactly where we need her. "What did you tell her?" "That I wanted to discuss Diana's final weeks. Share some information that might help her understand what really happened." Vincent's smile was predatory. "I also mentioned that you'd be there, which should make her feel safer." Blake understood the psychology. Sarah Chun would be more likely to meet with Vincent if she believed Blake's presence would prevent any violence. She couldn't know that Blake Morrison was no longer the innocent 14-year-old who needed protection. He was Vincent Morrison's heir and willing accomplice. "Text her back," Vincent instructed. "Tell her you trust me and that you want to hear what she has to say about your mother." Blake typed the response, each word feeling like another nail in Sarah Chen's coffin. By agreeing to the meeting, she was walking into a trap that had been designed specifically for her, constructed with the same attention to detail Vincent brought to every kill. At 2:45 p.m., they entered the hotel through separate entrances. Vincent went directly to the bar, while Blake took the elevator to the 20th floor, where he would position himself for the final act of Sarah Chen's life. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Vincent would drug Sarah's drink during their conversation, then excuse himself to use the restroom. Blake would appear at her table, claiming his father had sent him to escort her upstairs for a private conversation. Once in her room, the drugs would take full effect, and Sarah Chun would take a swan dive from her window. Blake found room 2012 and used the electronic key card Vincent's people had provided to let himself in. The room was exactly as advertised: 20th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows, spectacular view of the Connecticut River Valley. It was also the perfect stage for a carefully choreographed murder. Blake positioned himself by the window and waited, his phone buzzing with updates from his father. "She's here. Nervous, but cooperative. Ordering drinks. Scotch for me, wine for her. Discussing Diana's childhood. She's relaxing. Drug administered. 15 minutes until full effect." Blake checked his watch and prepared for his entrance. In the bar below, Sarah Chun was learning firsthand why Vincent Morrison had been so successful in business. He could make anyone believe anything if it served his purposes. She probably felt safe, maybe even grateful that Diana's husband was finally opening up about his wife's final weeks. Blake's phone buzzed. Now. He took the elevator down to the bar and spotted Sarah immediately. She was sitting across from his father in a corner booth, her wine glass nearly empty and her posture already showing the subtle effects of whatever Vincent had slipped into her drink. She looked up as Blake approached, her face brightening with the kind of relief that came from seeing a familiar anchor in an uncertain situation. "Blake, thank you for coming." Sarah's words were slightly slurred, her movements just sluggish enough to suggest she was fighting the drug's effects. "Your father's been telling me about your mother's final weeks. There are some things that don't make sense." Why don't we go upstairs where we can talk privately? Blake suggested, playing his role perfectly. Dad says you have some of Mom's things. Sarah nodded, though the motion seemed to cost her considerable effort. In my room. Letters, photos, things I thought you should see. Blake helped her to her feet, noting how she swayed slightly, and had to grip his arm for support. The drug was working exactly as Vincent had promised. Sarah Chun was conscious and cooperative, but increasingly disoriented and physically compromised. I'll join you in a few minutes, Vincent said, kissing Blake's forehead with paternal affection. Just going to settle the bill. In the elevator, Sarah leaned against the wall and studied Blake with eyes that were struggling to focus. You look so much like her. Your mother, I mean. She was so proud of you. Tell me about her, Blake said, genuinely curious about Diana's relationship with this woman who was about to die for caring too much. She was scared, Blake. Really scared. Not just of your father finding out about the affair, but of what he might do to all of you. Sarah's voice was growing weaker, her words more slurred. She said Vincent had done terrible things to people who crossed him. She was afraid you were next. The elevator doors opened on the 20th floor. Blake guided Sarah down the hallway toward her room, each step bringing them closer to the window that would end her life. Mom was confused, Blake said gently. Dad would never hurt me. He loves me. That's what she thought too, until she realized what kind of man she'd married. Sarah fumbled for her key card, her coordination deteriorating rapidly. Blake, your mother knew she was going to die. She called me the night before the crash, crying, saying she'd made a terrible mistake and that Vincent was going to kill both of them. Blake felt something twist in his chest. Even Diana's final phone call had been monitored, another piece of evidence that Vincent Morrison controlled every aspect of the narrative surrounding his wife's death. Here, let me help, Blake said, taking Sarah's key card and opening her room door. Sarah stumbled inside and collapsed into the chair by the window, her breathing shallow and labored. The drug was reaching its peak effectiveness, leaving her conscious but helpless, exactly the state Vincent needed her in for the final act. Blake, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The things I brought, they're in my bag. Your mother's journal, photos of the bruises. Blake froze. What bruises? The ones your father gave her. Diana documented everything, just in case. Sarah's eyes were struggling to stay open. She knew what kind of man he was. She was trying to protect you. Blake moved to Sarah's overnight bag and unzipped it with trembling fingers. Inside, he found exactly what she'd described. Photocopies of journal entries he'd never seen. Pictures of Diana with bruises on her arms and neck, and a letter addressed to him in his mother's handwriting. My dearest Blake, if you're reading this, then the worst has happened and your father has carried out his threats. I want you to know that everything I did, including the affair that probably cost me my life, was motivated by love for you. Your father has been hurting me for months, ever since I began questioning some of his business practices. The bruises I've documented are nothing compared to what he's capable of when truly angry. I'm terrified that his violence will eventually turn toward you. I know this will be hard to accept, but Vincent Morrison is a dangerous man who has hurt many people over the years. I stayed silent because I was afraid, but I can't let that fear cost you your life. Run, Blake. Get as far away from your father as possible. Don't let him turn you into what he is. I love you more than my own life. Mom. Blake's hands shook as he processed what he was reading. Diana hadn't just been unfaithful, she'd been abused. Her affair with Troy hadn't been about passion or romance. It had been about escape from a husband who'd been systematically destroying her for months. She tried to save you, Sarah whispered from her chair. Diana knew what your father was, and she died trying to get you away from him. Blake looked at the photographs again, seeing his mother's bruises with new understanding. Vincent Morrison hadn't killed Diana in a fit of rage over her betrayal. He'd been planning her death for months, using her desperation and fear to drive her into Troy's arms, and then punishing them both for the relationship he'd essentially forced her into. Blake's phone buzzed with a text from Vincent. Status. Blake stared at the phone, then at Sarah Chun, who was fighting to stay conscious in her chair by the window. In a few minutes, his father would arrive expecting to find Sarah drugged and ready for her final flight. Instead, he would find his son holding evidence that Diana Morrison had been a victim rather than a villain. Blake made his choice. Instead of replying to Vincent's text, he called 911. I need an ambulance at the Marriott downtown. 20th floor, room 2012. A woman has been drugged and is in immediate danger. Sarah's eyes widened as she processed what Blake was doing. Blake, I know, he said, kneeling beside her chair. I know what he is. I know what he did to Mom. And I know he's planning to kill you too. Blake's phone exploded with calls and texts from Vincent, but he ignored them all. Instead, he gathered Sarah's evidence and helped her to the bed, keeping her talking and alert until the paramedics arrived. When hotel security and the EMTs burst into the room, they found Blake Morrison sitting beside an unconscious woman, holding a manila folder full of evidence that would destroy his father's carefully constructed empire. Vincent Morrison arrived at the hotel 30 minutes later to find police cars and ambulances surrounding the building. He stood on the sidewalk, watching his son being interviewed by detectives, and understood immediately that 25 years of careful planning had just been undone by a 14-year-old boy who'd chosen conscience over loyalty. Blake Morrison was no longer his father's son. He was something far more dangerous. He was a witness who couldn't be eliminated. Vincent Morrison had built his empire on the principle that everyone could be bought, intimidated, or killed. But as he watched his son hand over evidence that would destroy him, he realized he'd finally encountered someone who was none of those things. Blake Morrison was his mother's son after all. The Morrison empire was about to fall, brought down not by business rivals or law enforcement, but by a boy who'd learned that some loyalties were more important than others. Some men forgave their enemies. Some men forgot past wrongs. Blake Morrison chose justice over family, and Vincent Morrison would spend the rest of his life paying the price for underestimating the power of that choice. Epilogue. Vincent Morrison was sentenced to life without parole for the murders of Diana Morrison, Troy Kellerman, and two other victims whose bodies were discovered after Blake's testimony led police to previously unknown crime scenes. He died in federal prison 18 months later, officially of a heart attack, though rumors persisted that Vincent Morrison's reputation had finally caught up with him in a place where money and influence meant nothing. Blake Morrison, now Blake Chun after being adopted by Sarah's family, graduated valedictorian from Stanford University and went on to become a federal prosecutor specializing in organized crime. He never married, never had children, and never returned to Connecticut. Sarah Chun recovered fully from her poisoning and became Blake's legal guardian, raising him with the love and stability that Diana Morrison had died trying to provide. She never spoke publicly about the events at the hotel, but she kept Diana's journal and photographs as evidence that some victories came at a price too high to calculate. The Morrison construction empire collapsed within 6 months of Vincent's arrest, its assets seized by federal authorities, and its contracts canceled by clients who wanted no association with a company built on murder. The Georgian Colonial in Westchester was sold at auction, its proceeds donated to victims' rights organizations. Blake Morrison had chosen justice over loyalty, truth over family, and the right kind of strength over the wrong kind of power. In doing so, he'd saved not just Sarah Chen's life, but his own soul. Some prices were worth paying, even when they cost you everything you'd ever known. Especially then. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.